My daughter was dying of leukemia, and my whole family vanished. My ex-husband's wife laughed. You're just a poor writer. Deal with it. She died weeks later. Then I wrote one sentence that made every one of them come crawling back. You're just a poor writer. Deal with it. That's what my ex-husband's new wife said when I called her at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, begging for someone, anyone, to watch my two younger boys so I could sit at my daughter's bedside while her monitors beeped through the dark. She said it the way you'd read a grocery list. Milk, eggs, bread, deal with it. Cora was 9. Her leukemia had come back after a year of remission. The kind of relapse the oncologist described to me in a small conference room with a box of tissues already sitting on the table, like they knew before I did that I'd need them. The hospital was 90 minutes from my house. I was a freelance writer, no sick days, no paid leave, no backup plan, because backup plans require people, and I was about to find out exactly how few of those I actually had. I sat in a plastic chair in the hallway outside Cora's room after that phone call, the phone still warm in my hand, and I didn't cry. I'd already used up that day's crying before dinner. I just sat there doing math. Who could take Eli and Nate for even one afternoon? Who owed me a favor? Who might, if I asked the right way, finally show up? The answer, it turned out, was no one. I went back into my daughter's room and picked up a pencil. I didn't know yet that it would become the only tool that eventually got me through any of it. I'd been a freelance writer for 6 years by then, the kind of career that looks flexible from the outside and feels, from the inside, like running a small business with no employees, no safety net, and a client list that could evaporate overnight. I wrote copy for a regional healthcare network, ghost wrote blog posts for 2 local law firms, and picked up magazine assignments when I could get them. It paid the mortgage most months. It did not come with sick leave, and it definitely didn't come with anyone else's help. Mark and I had married young, at 23, in a backyard ceremony his mother had planned more than either of us had. We had Cora 2 years later, then Eli, then Nate, and somewhere around Nate's 2nd birthday, the marriage simply stopped working the way marriages sometimes do. Not with betrayal, just with 2 people who'd grown into different shapes than the ones that had fit together at 23. The divorce was ordinary, almost gentle, the kind lawyers describe as amicable. I got the house. He got every other weekend with the kids, an arrangement that lasted, faithfully, for about a year before Belle entered the picture, and his every other weekend started shrinking into every other month, then less. My mother, Diane, was not the kind of woman who did favors without keeping score somewhere in her head, a ledger she updated constantly and consulted whenever it suited her. My father, Robert, sat behind her on every phone call like a man watching a television show he had no opinion about, letting her speak for both of them, which she always did anyway. My ex-husband Mark and I had split up 4 years earlier, an ordinary divorce as divorces go, and he'd remarried within 18 months to a woman named Belle, who had made it clear, in 100 small ways since, that our children were an inconvenience she tolerated rather than a family she'd married into. Cora was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia the spring she turned 8, and for a year, treatment worked. She went into remission that October, lost her hair and grew it back curlier than before, went back to school, played soccer for one glorious spring season before the fatigue crept back in. I told myself the fatigue was nothing. Kids get tired. Soccer season was long. I told myself that for almost 3 weeks before the blood work came back and Dr. Priya Nasser, her pediatric oncologist, called me into that same small conference room with the same box of tissues and told me gently that the leukemia was back, and this time it would be harder to treat. I remember that conference room in a level of detail that surprises me even now. A poster on the wall about hand hygiene, a box of tissues with a floral pattern that seemed almost cruelly cheerful. Nasser's voice steady and careful as she explained the word relapse in terms an 8-year-old's mother could actually process through the ringing in her ears. She used the phrase harder to treat instead of anything more frightening, and I remember being grateful for that restraint even as some part of me understood exactly what it meant underneath the careful language. I should have known looking back how alone I actually was. My mother had never once offered to keep the boys overnight during Cora's first round of treatment the year before. She'd come to the hospital twice, brought flowers once, and mostly sent texts asking for updates she could relay to her garden club. I'd told myself that was just how she was, that she loved us in her own limited way, that showing up wasn't the only way to show you cared. I believed that story about her for a very long time. The relapse is what finally started tearing it apart. Loop 1. I called my mother first, the night I learned Cora was being readmitted, because some part of me still believed that a hospitalized grandchild would be the thing that finally moved her. You chose this life, she said, when I asked if she could take Eli and Nate for even a few days. Don't make it ours. Chose it. Like Cora's cancer had taken a vote and I'd been the deciding ballot. I stood in the hospital parking garage when she said it. Phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly, and for a moment I genuinely couldn't make my mouth form a response. I told myself she was in shock, that the words had come out wrong, that she'd call back in an hour once it sank in what she'd actually said. My father sat behind her the whole call, silent, the television humming somewhere in their living room. He never called back. Neither did she. I drove home from the hospital that night on autopilot, and when I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside and be a functioning mother to the 2 boys waiting for me, because I needed those 10 minutes to stop my hands from shaking enough to trust myself around a stove, a bath, bedtime stories, all the small, ordinary tasks that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Loop 2. I called Mark next. Belle answered his phone, laughing before I'd even finished my sentence, like whatever had made her laugh moments earlier hadn't fully faded yet. You're just a poor writer, she said. Deal with it. Mark got on the line for exactly 1 sentence. Now's not a good time for us. And then the call all ended, and I stood in the hospital hallway holding a phone that had gone dead in my hand, telling myself, absurdly, that maybe I'd caught them at a bad moment, that Mark would text me later, apologetic, once Belle wasn't in the room. He didn't. I checked my phone every hour for 2 days before I finally stopped checking. On the third day, a nurse's aide found me crying in the supply closet off the pediatric ward, not because I'd meant to hide there, just because it was the first empty room I'd found, and she sat with me for 4 minutes without saying a word before her pager went off and she had to leave. I never learned her name. I think about her more often than I'd have expected to. Loop 3. I sent one message to the family group chat 2 weeks later, when the boys' school called about a mandatory parent conference I had no way to attend from a hospital 90 minutes away. Cora's back in the hospital. If anyone can take the boys, even one afternoon, it would help. Delivered, read, silence from every single person in that chat for 6 hours, and then nothing at all. I remember staring at the little read timestamp under my message, watching it sit there unanswered, and doing the thing I'd apparently trained myself to do by then, building a story that made the silence forgivable. Maybe they were all busy. Maybe someone was drafting a longer response and wanted to get it right. Maybe my mother was on the phone with a neighbor and would call the second she hung up. I checked my phone every 15 minutes for 2 hours that afternoon while Cora slept beside me, her chest rising and falling under a hospital blanket printed with faded cartoon fish, and each time I checked and found nothing new, the story I was telling myself got a little harder to keep believing. That same afternoon, my mother posted photos from her garden club luncheon, pastel cardigans, little tea sandwiches on a 3-tiered tray, a caption reading, "So blessed by my girls," 41 likes. I sat in a hospital chair with Cora asleep beside me, an IV pole humming, and scrolled through photos of women in cardigans eating sandwiches while my daughter's blood counts dropped by the day, and something in me went quiet in a way that didn't feel like giving up so much as finally understanding the shape of the thing I was dealing with. I stopped waiting after that. Not out of some dramatic decision, more the way a person stops checking a bank account that's been empty for months. You just eventually accept there's nothing coming, and you build your life around the absence instead of the hope. Loop 4. I sold the second car in November, a decision that took less deliberation than I expected because I'd already done the math 3 times, and there wasn't another number that worked. I learned which gas station on Route 9 was 4 cents cheaper per gallon, and started planning my drive time around it, 90 minutes each way, sometimes twice in a day. I picked up 2 extra copywriting clients that month, working in the hospital's family lounge on a laptop balanced on my knees between Cora's chemo cycles. Billing hours I mostly earned at 1 and 2 in the morning while she slept. A nurse named Angela Reyes, a pediatric oncology nurse with 12 years on the unit, the kind of woman who noticed things other people missed, started leaving a small cup of vanilla pudding by my chair around 2 a.m. without ever asking why I needed it, without ever making me explain that I hadn't eaten a real meal since the previous afternoon. Loop 5. One night in December, Cora spiked a fever that the monitors read as dangerous before I'd even finished asking the nurse what the numbers meant. I called my mother at 8:14 p.m., my hands shaking hard enough that I nearly dropped the phone twice dialing. It rang out, no voicemail, just ringing, and then silence, and then the sound of Cora's monitor alarm cutting through the room behind me. A rapid response team arrived within 90 seconds, a resident whose name I never caught, a respiratory therapist adjusting an oxygen line, Angela already at the bedside before I'd finished processing what was happening. I stood pressed against the wall out of the way, my phone still in my hand, watching numbers on a screen that meant nothing to me and everything to the people reading them. I called my mother again at 8:19. It rang out again. I called my father's cell directly at 8:22, something I almost never did, and got his voicemail, his voice cheerful and dated, recorded years earlier, telling me to leave a message after the tone. I didn't leave one. I don't know what I would have said. Cora's fever broke around 3 a.m., the room slowly emptying of the people who'd rushed in, the alarms finally quiet, and I sat in the chair beside her bed with my whole body shaking in the aftermath the way it hadn't shaken during the actual crisis. Adrenaline finally catching up to me once there was nothing left to do but wait. The next morning, once the fever had broken and Cora was sleeping again, stable for the moment, I checked my mother's garden club post from the day before out of some compulsive need I couldn't fully explain to myself. The timestamp read 8:14 p.m., the exact minute my daughter's monitor had been screaming and my mother's phone had been ringing, unanswered, inside her purse at a luncheon. Belle's story from that same hour, posted to her own page. A wine bar, 2 glasses clinking together in a photo captioned date night. I stopped asking after that, not out of pride, out of arithmetic. You can't keep withdrawing from an account that never held a single dollar meant for you. The middle of that winter is the part I remember least clearly and most completely at the same time. Clearly in the sense that certain images never leave you. Unclearly in the sense that the days themselves blurred into a single long corridor of fluorescent light and vending machine coffee. Dr. Nasser met with me every Tuesday to walk through Cora's counts. Always direct, always careful to explain what the numbers meant without either false hope or unnecessary despair. The kind of honesty I came to depend on more than I depended on anyone in my own family. I'll tell you exactly what I know and exactly what I don't, she told me at our first meeting after the relapse. And I need you to trust that when I don't have an answer, it's because there genuinely isn't one yet, not because I'm protecting you from it. I held onto that sentence more than I expected to. The hospital's oncology social worker, Renee Okafor, LCSW, helped me apply for a hardship grant through the hospital's foundation and a state program for families of children with catastrophic illness. Paperwork thick enough that I kept it in its own folder, tabbed and organized the way I'd once organized freelance invoices. Renee also connected me with a local nonprofit that covered 2 months of childcare for Eli and Nate. Real childcare, a licensed in-home stay-at-home provider named Marisol, who picked the boys up from school on the days I couldn't be there, and never once made me feel like a burden for needing it, which was more than my own mother had managed in 9 months. I hired a family law attorney that same winter, not for anything dramatic, just to understand my rights regarding Mark's child support obligations, which had quietly lapsed twice that year, while he claimed, through his own attorney, that his construction business was in a rough patch. The attorney, a woman named Deborah Klein who specialized in family law and had seen, in her words, every version of a father disappearing when things got hard, helped me file for wage garnishment through the county's child support enforcement office. It took 4 months to process. It felt, when the first payment finally landed, less like a victory and more like proof that I'd have had to fight for that money, regardless of whether my daughter was dying, which was its own particular kind of grief. Deborah also flagged something I hadn't thought to ask about, whether I had any documentation of the family's repeated refusals to help, in case it ever mattered for custody purposes involving Eli and Nate down the road. You don't need it now, she told me, but courts pay attention to patterns, and patterns need paper. I started keeping a folder after that, printouts of the group chat, screenshots time-stamped and saved, not because I expected to use them in any courtroom, but because Deborah's advice made me realize, for the first time, that I had permission to stop pretending the pattern wasn't real. I want to be honest about something. I didn't handle all of it well. There were nights I screamed into a pillow in a hospital family lounge so Cora wouldn't hear me through the wall. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. There was a week in January when I forgot to pay the electric bill because I hadn't slept more than 3 hours in 5 days, and I sat on hold with the utility company for 40 minutes crying quietly while a recorded voice told me my estimated wait time. A hospital chaplain named Father Owen Tully found me in the family lounge one of those nights, didn't ask if I wanted to talk, just sat 2 chairs down and stayed until I was ready to say something, which turned out to take almost an hour. I'm not the hero of this story in the way stories usually want their narrators to be. I was just a woman running on fumes and vanilla pudding, trying to be in 2 places at once, and mostly failing at both. Cora died on a Sunday morning, early, quiet. The hospital hallway outside her room still dim with pre-dawn light. Dr. Nasser had told me the week before, as gently as anyone can tell a mother something like that we were out of options that made sense to try. I held my daughter the way I'd held her the day she was born, 9 years and 4 months earlier, in a different hospital, on a different kind of morning. Angela was there. She didn't say anything. She just stayed and adjusted the blanket once and let me have the room. I don't remember driving home that morning. I remember Eli and Nate's faces when I told them, 5 and 3 at the time, too young to fully understand what gone meant, but old enough to understand that something in the house had permanently changed shape. I remember calling my mother to tell her, my voice flat and strange in my own ears, and hearing her cry immediately, loudly, in a way that felt, even then, more performed than felt, grief arriving on cue, the way it does for people who've spent a lifetime rehearsing how sadness is supposed to look, rather than simply feeling it. At the funeral 4 days later, my mother cried harder than anyone else present, loud enough that people 2 rows back turned to look, and told a cousin, within my hearing, we did everything we could. I didn't correct her. You don't fight at your daughter's funeral. I stood there in a black dress I'd bought 2 days earlier because I hadn't owned anything appropriate, and I let my mother perform her grief for an audience because I had nothing left in me to spend on setting the record straight. Mark stood near the back with Belle, leaving before the reception, and I remember thinking, distantly, that I felt almost nothing watching him go. Not relief, not anger, just the flat exhaustion of a woman who'd already spent every emotion she had months earlier in a hospital hallway on a night nobody answered the phone. Angela gave me a notebook about 6 weeks later, at a grief support meeting she'd started attending on her own time, off the clock, because she said she couldn't stop thinking about our family. Write it down, she told me, pressing the notebook into my hands in the parking lot afterward, even the parts you can't say out loud. I didn't think I'd use it. It sat on my kitchen counter for 11 days, unopened, a plain black notebook I kept meaning to move somewhere out of sight and never quite managed to. I used it that same night I finally cracked, sitting at my kitchen table at midnight with Eli and Nate asleep upstairs, a glass of wine I never finished going warm beside me, and I wrote the first sentence almost by accident, the way you sometimes discover you're crying before you notice your face is wet. The first sentence was about the phone call, Belle's laugh, the exact words, the grocery list flatness of them. Once that sentence existed on paper, the second one came easier, and the third easier still, and over the following 8 months, in the fragments of time, a freelance writer with 2 grieving little boys could scrape together, early mornings before the boys woke, the odd stolen hour during nap time, entire weekends after a particularly hard session with Renee when writing felt like the only language left that made any sense. It became a book. I changed every name except Cora's. She earned the truth of her own name. Everyone else got to hide behind fiction, which was more mercy than they'd shown me. On page 204, I wrote Belle's exact words, the ones I'd never forgotten no matter how much of that year had blurred together. You're just a poor writer. Deal with it. I found a literary agent, a woman named Carla Whitfield, no relation, an odd coincidence neither of us commented on more than once, who read the manuscript over a single weekend and called me Monday morning to say she wanted to represent it. I read a lot of grief memoirs, she told me on that first call. Most of them ask you to feel sorry for the writer. Yours doesn't ask for anything. It just tells the truth and lets the reader decide what to feel. That's rare. It sold to a mid-sized publisher within 3 months, faster than either of us expected, after a modest bidding process between 2 houses that Carla walked me through step by step, translating terms like advance against royalties and first serial rights into language I I could actually understand between freelance deadlines and school pickups. The book released the following spring, under the title I'd chosen the night I wrote that first true sentence, The Waiting Room. My editor, a soft-spoken man named Desmond Hale, who'd lost his own father to a long illness years earlier, told me during our final read-through that the manuscript was the most honest thing he'd worked on in 15 years in publishing. Most memoirs about illness try to make the illness the villain, he said. Yours makes the silence the villain instead. That's the part people won't be able to look away from. A book reviewer for a regional newspaper, Priya Ramchand, pulled the page 2104 line for her headline, You're Just a Poor Writer, a mother's devastating account of being left alone. The review went everywhere. Shared, screenshotted, quoted in 3 different online magazines within a week, picked up eventually by a national morning show that invited me on for a 6-minute segment I nearly declined out of sheer exhaustion at the idea of saying any of it out loud to a camera. I did it anyway, sitting in a studio chair with my hands folded in my lap the way I'd once folded them in hospital waiting rooms. And when the host asked me what I wanted readers to take from the book, I said the truest thing I had. That showing up isn't optional, it's the whole job. The book hit a regional bestseller list within 2 weeks of release, then a national one 6 weeks after that. Strangers wrote me letters, dozens of them, then hundreds. Women who'd also slept in hospital chairs while their own families stayed home with excuses. Women who told me, in careful handwriting, that they'd finally shown the book to a sister or a mother and said simply, this is what it felt like. The family group chat, silent for nearly a year by then, lit up within days of the review going viral. My mother posted the book cover with the caption, so proud of my daughter. Belle left a 5-star review on the retailer site, calling me brave and talented, a sentence I read 4 times trying to reconcile it with the woman who'd laughed into a phone while my daughter's monitor screamed in the background. Not one of them, in any message, any comment, any review, said Cora's name. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. I read every comment my mother left under every post about the book, dozens of them within the first month, warm, effusive, tagging old friends, telling her garden club, according to a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it to me at the grocery store, that she'd always known I had it in me. Not once did she mention her granddaughter. The book that made her proud was, in her retelling, entirely about me. It was never about the child she hadn't shown up for. I sat with that for a long time before the porch visit happened, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath. My mother's pride, I finally understood, had never once been about Cora. Not on the day she was born, not on the day she died, not on any of the days in between. It had always only been about what reflected well on her. A best-selling daughter was a story she wanted to tell at garden club. A dying granddaughter she'd have had to actually show up for was not. A week after the review went national, they knocked on my porch, all 4 of them, together, which told me before anyone said a word that this had been planned, coordinated, rehearsed somewhere in advance of arriving. My mother held a bouquet of grocery store flowers, cellophane still crinkling around the stems. My father stood behind her, hands in his pockets, the same posture he'd kept through every phone call that mattered. Mark and Belle stood slightly apart from my parents, dressed the way people dress when they've decided in advance how the conversation should look in photographs, though there were no cameras that day, just the 4 of them and me and the late afternoon light. I almost didn't open the door. I stood in my hallway for a full 30 seconds after the doorbell rang, watching all 4 of them through the narrow window beside the frame, my hand on the latch, running through every version of this conversation I'd already had in my head 100 times over the past year. Eli and Nate were upstairs, and some part of me wanted to keep it that way, to handle whatever this was without them anywhere nearby. I opened the door anyway, because some conversations you have to finish standing up, in daylight, so you can walk away from them clean. We want to make things right, my mother said, holding out the flowers like an offering. We're family. It took less than 2 minutes for the real reason to surface. My mother mentioned almost in passing that she'd heard I might be working on a second book, and wouldn't it be nice, she said, if this one had some good family memories in it instead. Mark, standing slightly behind Belle, mentioned that he'd been thinking he wanted regular visits with Eli and Nate, sons he hadn't asked to see more than 4 times in the past year, sons whose school picture day he'd missed twice in a row without explanation. I let each of them finish speaking before I said anything at all, mostly because I wanted to be sure I'd heard the whole shape of what they'd actually driven over to ask for, rather than reacting to the first sentence and letting them retreat into the softer version they'd clearly rehearsed. My father, notably, said nothing the entire time, standing behind my mother exactly the way he'd sat behind her on every phone call that had mattered, a man who had apparently decided somewhere along the way that silence was a safe enough place to live out an entire relationship with his own daughter and granddaughter. Belle stepped forward last, wearing the warmest smile I'd ever seen on her face, an expression I recognized instantly as performance, because I'd spent a year learning to tell the difference. We never meant that whole poor writer thing, she said. That was a hard day for everyone. A hard day for everyone. I turned that sentence over once in my mind, the way you might turn over a coin to check if it's counterfeit, and found it exactly as hollow as I expected. I stood in my own doorway, in the house my own words had bought. The mortgage paid off entirely within 4 months of the book's release, a fact none of them knew and none of them would learn from me, and I felt nothing shake loose in me at all. No rage, no relief, just a kind of settled clarity I hadn't expected to feel, standing there. I gave it all to her, I said. Every hour, every dollar, every piece of myself. While the 4 of you decided it wasn't your job, there's nothing left over here for any of you. My mother's face cracked into something sharper, older, the mask finally slipping all the way off. After everything I sacrificed, what did you sacrifice? I asked, and I meant it honestly, not as an accusation dressed up as a question. Tell me one thing. One afternoon, one phone call you answered. She didn't have an answer. I watched her search for one, her mouth opening slightly and then closing again. And in that silence, I understood that she had genuinely never once, in the entire year, cataloged her own absence the way she'd cataloged everyone else's debts to her. You told me I chose this life, I said. You were right. I chose it, and I won't make it yours. I turned to Belle last because some part of me needed her to be the final word, the same way she'd been the first voice I heard that terrible night on the phone. She leaned in slightly, waiting, hungry in a way I could see now that I'd stopped needing her approval to notice it. You want to know what I really think? I said. You can read it the same as everyone else. Page 204. I stepped back inside and closed the door. No slam. I didn't have anything left to prove, and a door doesn't need to be loud to mean exactly what it means. It's been a year and a half now since that afternoon on the porch. I still see Renee Okafor for grief counseling every few weeks, a habit that outlasted the crisis that started it, because it turns out grief doesn't end when the paperwork does. Eli is 7 now, Nate is 5, and some nights they still ask about their sister in the unguarded, matter-of-fact way small children ask about the dead, and I answer them honestly every time, because I decided a long time ago that they deserved better than the silence I'd been handed by everyone who was supposed to protect me. Deborah Klein still handles the child support enforcement on the rare occasions Mark's payments lapse, though they've been more consistent since the book's success made his own attorney, I suspect, wary of how a custody dispute might read in the press. I've never used that leverage on purpose. I don't need to. Consistency, once it's finally enforced by a court instead of hoped for from a person, doesn't require me to ask for anything at all.